Elsa, is everything okay?
Mr. Ortiz, it's Elliot.
Front row seats at the Freak Olympics.
Oh dear, this is the men's room.
I'm a boy.
Imagine people feel the way that you feel.
Have any idea how much you freaked her
I
out?
can explain. You're hurting me. I'm more than just my pain.
Thank you all for being here, and I'm really excited as the president of GALECA to host this. I thought that Elliot was a really great episode of CW's 2-Cent Horror Stories, and it's a show I've only recently discovered, so I'm thinking a lot of folks out there are in the same boat. I know that the original vision for 2-Cent Horror Stories was to create a series that experiments and innovates and centralizes people of color and queer and trans folks behind the camera, in front of the camera, and it comes away and you can really feel this very intersectional horror series that can combine these like real issues like racism or homophobia with fairy tales and ghost stories and demonic madness and stuff like that. So what we're talking about today is Elliot, which is an episode, the timing is perfect. It's an episode about a young trans man who's a high schooler who's sort of just come out about his transition, is getting teased or bullied both by kids and by, you know, kind of clueless school officials, and then also bullied definitely by the principal of the school. This episode and this series is created, directed, and starring queer and trans talent and creators. And this episode is one that I think a lot of viewers might find just, you know, noteworthy, not in that, oh, what a very special episode, but more in that it's actually very well done. It works really well with the intersections of sort of like this troll under the bridge narrative with experience of somebody who's young and trans in high school. So who we have today is James Goldman, who is an actor who stars as Elliot in the episode. And then we have Liz Levine, executive producer and showrunner, who's a lesbian. Director Chase Joint is transgender. Writer Stephanie Adams Santos is queer and Latinx. Or do you prefer Guatemalan American?
Either.
Either? Okay, great. And series creator Vera, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Would you say it for me?
Meow.
Meow, okay. So Vera Meow is queer Asian American, born in Guam, and you've just done an amazing job with this entire series. So I'm really excited to have you all here. Why don't we start by asking people first what you relate to in this episode for each of you?
As a transmasculine artist and maker, I'm always looking for ways to dig in authentically and to take risks with those that I think are most impacted by the kinds of stories that we're telling. So the opportunity to work with someone like James as a young transmasculine actor was just too good to pass up.
Excellent. And James, you've had experiences, or have you had experiences to draw from for this role, since you really precisely sort of nail that feeling of like confusion and anger at being othered? I love, there's a moment, I don't think I'm giving it away when I say there's a moment where you say very brilliant dialogue and nod to Stephanie, I am more than my pain. And I just thought, wow, that really speaks to me for the trans experience. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in that?
I personally, I would say I'm very lucky in the way that I came out. I mean, every trans person faces some sort of transphobia at some point in their life. But for me, mostly it was more just ignorance. And of course, there came transphobia with that, but it was more accidental than, you know, scenes like with that principal literally being attacked in a basement. But definitely, I think that I related to just a lot of the really awkward parts of the episode. I remember like when I came out when I was 15 years old, I just turned 15. There was a lot of awkward instances where you're sort of like, okay, which way do I go? Which bathroom do I choose? Do I correct the name? Do I deal with this or do I let it go? It's a lot of picking battles. And I remember that feeling very vividly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Stephanie, I want to ask you if it was intentional the way some of the language really felt like it could speak to monsters or killers as much as it could speak to people who police and regulate trans bodies and women's bodies. Like there's a line in there where Elliot tells the other person, my body isn't yours to take. And I just thought, oh my God, that's so perfect as well. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the horror of the episode, and that kind of bigoted language, it's so ugly, and it seeks to always reduce and diminish and strip away humanity. It's language that comes from a really narrow and actually very monstrous place. And so it was really important to show that the characters who wield that kind of weaponized language, they are the ugly ones. They are the monsters. They're the very things that they're accusing Elliot of being. And you have, on the point we talked about earlier, you have all of these really negative forces kind of pushing Elliot into a corner of pain and reaction to pain. And that's so diminishing. The janitor tells him he has no choice but to hurt or be hurt. It's such an impossible situation because Elliot has been failed by the people and the systems around him that are coming from that twisted, narrow place that's so life-sapping. So when he says, I'm not just my pain, he's giving voice to that place of deeper anguish and really wanting to fight for the fullness of himself that fights against that kind of awful, diminishing language.
I love that. James, as a young actor, since this is one of your early roles, what is it like to be able to play at least some iteration of who you really are?
That was awesome. This was my first role out as a guy. I took a break for a few years from acting while I was dealing with that whole thing. And
whole thing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dilemma. But yeah, it was so incredible just to be able to act. Like for me, the biggest thing was just my short hair. That like I will never forget the day that I cut it off. It was amazing to just feel comfortable and be on camera and like, you know, watching small things back or seeing pictures of like me on set, and I'm like, wow, that's cool. That's awesome.
That's awesome. I'm sure that's great too for other people your age to see. You know, it's so rare and it's so nice to see it. Liz, you and James actually went to the same high school, both of you queer in different ways. Can you talk about that full circle moment that you were telling me a little bit about earlier?
Yeah, I mean, listen, working with James and Chase was a real gift on this episode. And I think we got sort of halfway through to a really exhausting and trying moment for James on set. And we took a break after that moment and wandered into my office. And it came out that we had both gone to the same, what might optically be perceived as a fairly conservative, private, all-girls school that is really, we got to share an amazing moment with our 30-year age difference, that this was a very special thing. And I think also, and James can speak to it too, but really both of us in our different queer journeys come from a place of privilege, both in that education at an institution that was so smart and progressive. And I think having also spent some time with James's dad, that we've also come from parents and families that have those attitudes and ideas. So there was a very sort of instantaneous connection there. I think we both feel blessed for the whole experience, really.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, I could not be even more grateful for my school. They've been so incredible. I'm actually wearing my grad ring right now. I love the school so much. I can't wait to go back.
And they accepted your transition. They accepted and eased your transition, no problems?
Yeah. I mean, they did their absolute best. They did what, you know, they thought they could do at the time. I was the first person that set of staff had dealt with as a transgender person. So it was all new to that set of staff. But I mean, even a couple of weeks ago or before the break, they had a meeting with me and this one other transgender guy who came out after me and just said, how can we make things better? How can we do better as a school? How can we make you more comfortable?
Oh, that's great. That's really exciting to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to Vera a little bit. I love what you're doing with this series overall. This idea of giving voice to women and people of color and LGBTQ creatives who often aren't in front of the camera or behind the camera. I'm really excited as an Indigenous woman. I'm really excited to see the Indigenous episode, Manifest Destiny, that's coming up later this year. Well, I should say later next month. And of course, the episode airing before Elliot, which some folks might see, is called Bagmen. It takes a really diverse sort of Breakfast Club setup and adds in that Asian horror twist. Tell me about your mission for this series and why it's important to you to start.
I mean, I think the mission for the series is sort of a representative of my mission as a storyteller and as a filmmaker. And it is stories are the way that humans make meaning. And so I actually think it's one of the most venerable, honorable, sort of, and privileged occupations to be able to take on. And, you know, my background is actually in social justice work, in a lot of queer people of color organizing, a lot of racial justice organizing, way before I ever thought it was possible to be involved in film and television. And I really carry that belief that another world is possible and that each of us can contribute whatever insignificant part to hopefully a larger collective effort to make a better world happen. So I'm a fan of horror since a very, very, very tiny age. And in a funny way, horror has been the lens with which I feel like I've been able to access deeper fears, bigger dreads, because there's a little bit of a distance and a little bit of a safety to the fantasy lens. And I think, you know, the mission of the show is really, on one hand, to provide quality, intelligent, thought-provoking psychological horror that both strives and aspires to honor the art of cinema, right? And Chase and I had really great conversations creatively about, you know, how to approach this episode from a craft perspective and a storytelling perspective. But also that centers, you know, people like me and people like the folks that I love and that have been in my community and my family and my world my whole life. And, you know, I really, when I pitched the show, while that's an abiding mission for me as a storyteller, it is core mission of the show itself. You know, one of the things that I said in the pitch was this will make for better horror, right? If we expand those who are centered in the story, it opens up just a huge, huge terrain of stories that we haven't chosen to access to our detriment. And this is pre-Get Out, and, you know, and so there's been so much progress happening along those lenses. And I think the final thing I'll say is what you see when we use horror and we center folks who are in this moment in time often marginalized is that we're always playing with a juxtaposition between fantasy evil and true villains. And I think that's the perspective, whether or not the episode focuses on identity or doesn't. I think that sort of interplay is what centering folks like us in these horror stories gives us the opportunity to really have fun in.
Yeah. Tell me, were there tropes that you're aiming to avoid in depicting these stories?
Oh, Diane. Yes. I mean, I've always said from the beginning, centering marginalized people who are often depicted as victims or villains in a genre that demands violence and darkness as catharsis is tricky territory. And, you know, Steph can speak to this too, as can Liz. You know, I would say that, you know, when we're developing stories, pitching ideas, writing scripts, all the way through, and Chase also feels this too, like as a director, all the way that through post, landmines everywhere. And, you know, I really, really, really always, it's like the first thing I say, you know, this show is not just about this sort of kind of weirdly blanket, studiously apolitical, neutral idea, which I don't think exists, of just a good story. If we can spend as much time thinking about like how that lighting looks and, you know, whether or not that cut works from, this shot to the next shot, we can think just as hard from the very beginning. Are we playing into some tropes? Are we playing into stereotypes? Are we moving into problematic territory? And sometimes even the conversation is in the room is, even though we can justify this dramatically, and we can even make a case that, the turn that we have our character takes makes sense and is interesting. Are we the folks, all of us personally, are we the folks who are okay standing behind this story, these images, this depiction? And I want the show always to question and interrogate that. And there have been times when it's like, you know what? This could be a legitimate story for someone else to tell. We as a show are not going to be the ones who put out that message or that image. And that's just as much, those questions are treated with just as much rigor as drama, as character development, as, the visual language.
That's really interesting, actually. Liz, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you as a showrunner on part of these your role in these conversations when people are having debates about whether if we're supposed to be telling the story.
Listen, I think that Vera has long and always for this show been our moral lighthouse and guide in the wilderness. We follow her ability to sort of question and parse all of the details here. It trickles down into casting. It trickles down into the shots that we choose to frame up on set, and who has the power in a frame at any given time, and where we're giving that power and who we're giving the story to. And this episode, Chase really came to the table with sort of this predator POV that sort of reinforced the idea that for a lot of trans people, there is the sense of always being watched, but also came to the table with the very clear sense that this was Elliot's story. And everything that you break down over the course of the process has to fit within that framework.
And Chase, tell me a little bit about how your work on this, how does your other film work that you've done? I know you've got a documentary that's on the festival circuit right now, the Billy Tipton documentary, and your work on another project. How does your other work influence what you've done here with this episode?
Yeah, maybe it's actually a great way to pick up on some of the breadcrumbs that Liz just dropped about POV and what does it mean to actually suture your attention to our trans lead. Where Elliot goes, we go. How Elliot feels, we feel. Where Elliot looks, we look. And what kind of narrative tension can we actually drive through committing to that throughout the entire narrative? I mostly work in the nonfiction space, but really at the boundaries of nonfiction, where I recognize that borrowing from fiction, borrowing from reenactment, borrowing from different kinds of performance is some ways the best way to get closer to the truth of a feeling or of a political moment. And, to pick up on the conversation about avoiding tropes or thinking about the history of representation of trans and gender nonconforming subjects in cinema, we think about the monsters and the liars and the deceivers or the trans people as jokes and gags. And for me, those were easily avoided by, again, suturing to Elliot and thinking very clearly about the kind of story that we were telling to draw attention to the non-transgenders, right? To be clear with what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The screen, the genders that are not trans. And from there's also little cheats that I make. Like, I know that the history of trans people in cinema is about trans people looking at themselves in the mirror. So the only time we see someone looking at themselves in the mirror is the principal who's reckoning with the kind of vile encounter of himself. And so there's the tiny embedded moments too that I think are more recognizable to those who might be thinking hard about trans representation, but that also makes sense to a much broader viewing public.
Yeah, absolutely. You can pick them up. They're like little Easter eggs. That's what I was saying. They're like little Easter eggs along the way that if you're used to so many of the way, I mean, especially because trans representation in film and television has just been so terrible over history. It's nice to find those embedded. How important was this ending to you as a trans person, as a trans director? How important was the ending?
Was the ending
of the episode?
Oh, hugely important. I think that there were so many conversations had prior to going to camera about how to get out of the episode in a way that allows us to feel hopeful and with Elliot in the imagination of his future, while also not sacrificing the very real lived reality, the ongoing reality of transphobia that informs so many of our lives and the various privileges and marginalizations that keep us closer to or away from various violences. And so to me, it's allowing the world to be with Elliot as an older man, still living and thriving, while also recognizing the kind of predatory nature of a surveilling public.
Right, yeah. One of our viewers has asked, Christopher Eggerston has asked about your views on the historic representations of trans characters in horror films. Can you speak a little bit to that? I know you could probably go on for hours about that, as we've, trans characters have often been monsterized in film.
Yeah, and I mean, I can say two quick things and not take up too much time. One of which is our dear friend Sam Fader has an incredible documentary on Netflix right now called Disclosure, which is a real reckoning of 100 years of representation of trans and gender nonconforming subjects in Hollywood cinema. And I think really does a careful thinking through of representation and its impacts. But also, as it relates to horror, representation is not a good or bad equation. There are so many ways that I know trans people, art lovers, cinema lovers, find things to hold on to, even in the most problematic of circumstances. It might be the first time you see something that sparks in you. It might be the encounter you have with someone else who feels similar to you in the viewing experience. And so I think it's important to think back carefully and to mine for both the good and the bad along the way.
Great. Now, whose choice was it to have Elliot not speak for the beginning of the episode? There seems like a long time where Elliot doesn't speak. We just hear what he hears.
Steph, do you want to speak to this maybe?
Sorry,
and then Chase?
I didn't hear the beginning of that.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure. I'm just wondering, was it a conscious decision? One of our panelists, Karel, has asked, was it a conscious decision to have Elliot not speak for the beginning of the episode? We just hear what he hears, basically. To me, it led to that more sense of invisibility or wanting to be invisible. But I was wondering if it was a conscious choice or if you were trying to get something across with it, or if it just is how it lined up.
Yeah, the opening was really about the opening with the gym scene was really about sort of showing this larger context that Elliot is being silenced in, that Elliot is being diminished in and made invisible. And that Elliot, we hear first how Elliot is being compartmentalized and mistaken. So yeah, you're exactly right.
Great. Tell me a little bit, anybody can speak to this. I find it really fascinating. So you've already, before the second season aired, you already got renewed for the third season, and you made the second season during a pandemic in Canada without any shutdowns. Can somebody tell me what this was like, making this series, this episode in this series during COVID?
It was a different experience of film and TV making, for sure. It, is a slower process in a machine that always takes time. But that worked for us. It worked for the thoughtfulness of the process. It worked because the crew had to emotionally invest in this from the bottom up. And that meant in wearing masks, in protecting each other, in respecting each other's health and safety. But it worked because that pushed further into respecting the content of the show itself and the social justice issues and the idea that we think about others. And so I feel like it actually created some magic that made this team really come together with feeling like we had a greater purpose than just making another television show.
And when you guys talk to the folks at CW, do you use words like social justice? Do those, they're completely behind this sort of mandate?
Yeah, the network is, I'm going to be honest, when I created the show, and then the first season was actually available digitally, and so that predated the first season on CW, which is currently on Netflix. And I'm to be 100% honest. No one would have said, Vera, what if the show ended up on CW on broadcast television? And I would have been like, that's exactly on my vision board right there. It was not, not for me at least, a logical leap. But the network has been, really good partners because what we've talked about, as I've always said, is baked into the DNA of the show at the beginning. It's part of the pitch. My pitch was, this is a psychological horror anthology series, sort of like an updated Twilight Zone, with queer folks, trans folks, people of color in front of and behind the camera because they're centralized. And, and that we're using horror a la Twilight Zone to engage in some of the timely issues around us. Yeah. And so the network has been, and so as a show, we bleed that through everything, right? So it's not just the characters in the story. It's not just sort of, there's no unintentional casting, for instance, but there's also no unintentional hiring. And that goes all the way up and down the line. And so one of the things that I've said to the network a bunch is this is not a traditional television show in terms of how it functions and how it operates. And so applying traditional television practices, metrics, and sort of experiences oftentimes works against the magic of the show. And so they have been, really good partners, in ways that I'm very grateful for and appreciative of, in terms of both accepting that and also learning what does that actually look like in practice.
That's really great. I mean, again, now knowing that you're already renewed for your 3rd season must mean they think you're doing something right, which is really great. I think, though, that we're seeing CW seems to be one of the leaders in LGBTQ representation in many ways right now as well.
Yeah, I think.
So one of the things, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what you'll see if you watch all of the seasons of the show, I think that we go back and forth, right, between centering a particular identity in the show itself and then not doing that, right, but populating the show still with folks who look like us, and then therefore their journey through whatever sets of issues are influenced and shaped by who they are. And so, for me, Elliot is an incredible episode, but it is absolutely an episode in a universe of episodes that do center queer and trans folks. And they may or may not be engaged with issues that are specific to being queer and trans. And that's going to be an ongoing, that's been the case for the show from its very first digital inception, and will keep being the case. We also have crazy hella queers on this show, frankly. So, and it's just, the characters are the folks that we know.
That actually reminds me of the episode that airs along with Elliot. Prior to Elliot is the Bagman, and it's actually very much like an Asian horror spin on The Breakfast Club, which I loved. You recognize it, from my generation as Gen X, we recognize it right away, what it is and what it's a play on, but with that twist. And there are queer characters in it, but they are so secondary to everything that they just, it's seamless in there. And I thought that was very well done as well. I hope folks take time to watch that episode as well, because it's incredibly well done as well. So one of the things that folks keep asking is, this is a week where America is seeing what many people think of as a horror in the Capitol. How, given sort of the current headlines, are there new monsters appearing in the world, like from the current events, that you can take into story frames? And this could be a question for Stephanie or Vera or anybody here.
I have a response, but I'm going to let Steph go first.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that was so new. We, in fact, on that day, we couldn't function as a normal writers group. We took time to just be humans and process and
the same thing for us. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it takes time, and we don't want to be just grabbing headlines and not thoughtfully weaving things into the show. I think it comes more from what's, you know, what's sitting in our hearts and pressing there, and those things find a way in. I'm sure that the general anxiety that we're in is finding its way into the episodes, and you'll see how that happens. But yeah, we're always in dialogue with what's happening. It's just not all necessarily that one-to-one or quick of a process.
Direct take, yeah, that makes sense to me. And Vera, do you want to add to that?
I think people have said before that horror and comedy are sort of, they hold hands a little bit in a bunch of different ways. And much as, you know, for the entire last 4 years, comedy has sort of freaked out. Like, how are we funny when, how can we make fun of anything when everything's a farce? And, you know, funny is no longer funny because the situation is what it is. And there's not a lot of space for irony. And I think similar to horror, I am less interested in taking rip from the headlines approach, because I think I'm not sure then that we're motivated by the things that animate really well-told character-driven stories when we're doing that. At the same time, the show very much so is very committed to exploring the underlying elements that made what happened at the Capitol possible. And those are incredibly urgent for us to tackle. And, you know, there are obviously constraints to which we can engage given the, you know, fiction, horror, commercial breaks, television show, podcast, you know, but the degree to which that we, within what we're, the playground where we have to look unflinchingly at the true monsters and to not back away from, you know, the ugly realities that drive human behavior that accumulate into what we saw last week. Absolutely, that's the show, that's what the show comes from. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, it's a very thoughtful process about the best way in, and also quite frankly, sometimes an intuitive process. Does it make you feel something when you talk about that? You know, Elliot as a story, you know, immediately, and you can see like James is the best, you know, and you immediately feel, and that's on a lot of levels, you know, besides the whole intellectual process and the analytical process and the creative process, there's also an intuitive one. So
let's go back to that episode for just a bit. There is a magical instrument in the episode. Is that pulled from a particular mythical tale? I know the overarching tale is really a troll into the bridge type trope, but the instrument in it, is that pulled from the same sort of story lore?
No, that was actually inspired by Mandy. There is the Horn of Abraxis is like this demonic horn that summons these totally evil creatures, and it just it was a physical inspiration, you know, just like this arcane object. And I think they did such a good job with the prop, you know, creating that object, that it was one of my favorite moments. Actually, it's such a small moment in the story, but is when the janitor is handing that instrument to Elliot and he blows in it and nothing happens, and he looks up and says, how does it work? You know, there's so much like mystery and tension there, and it's sort of, you're ready to find out what's behind this sort of mysterious dark object.
And the janitor, of course, is, I have to note, is Margot Kidder's niece, which is, I think, a nice little nod to something. And I am not familiar with his work, but I read that the principal is a well-known actor in Canada. So I thought that was interesting casting to offset lesser-known stars in the series. So I thought that was really interesting. One of the things that I find as a thread through the story is also this question of power. You know, do you want the power you've been given? How do you use the power properly? Should you take power can anybody else give you power? Those kinds of things. So a very silly question for everybody. If you had special powers, what would you like them to be? James, why don't you start us off?
This is brutal. Okay. I think I speak for every trans person when I say we all want the ability to shapeshift, please and thank you. If that's off the table though, if I'm not allowed to answer that way, I think I would definitely say flying, just because I am like an extreme sports guy. I love anything that my mom hates. So if I could, just be zooming through the sky, that would be nice.
That's excellent.
I love that.
How about somebody else?
Well, I think for my job, I'd probably go with mind reader would be a nice superpower to have. I didn't do so bad though, right, Chase? I got into his brain pretty good.
Still do, Liz, still do.
How about
unimaginative? Maybe I would ask for, this is not a well thought out or deeply thought answer, but right now off the cuff, maybe I would like the ability to transmute things into other things.
Oh, yeah. Would we not all love that? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Chase and James, as trans men, this is very special just to have trans inclusion, but I know also that, we have young trans people watching you and learning from you guys. Oh, this is, I can make it, I can have a career, I can be successful, I can be happy, all those things that a lot of trans kids never got to see. Do you have, sort of any kind of message about your own journey that you'd like to impart?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that I wish I could tell my younger self is just, it's okay, chill out, take a breath. I think that, especially like the first few stages of transitioning and figuring everything out, it's just terrifying. I mean, I was constantly just panicked, and I think I can say that for every trans person. It's a lot of panic, it's a lot of feeling alone. You feel like you have to rush, and that there's something that you like need to get out there and rush through, and there's just so much uncertainty. And I wish that I could just tell all the younger trans kids of the world, just, it's okay. Like, nothing really matters as much as you think it does. Eventually, say someone misgenders you tomorrow, in 10 years you'll forget about it. It doesn't matter, you'll be okay.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think because non-trans folks tend to, or cisgender folks tend to think of transition as like this solid line before and after, and so we put that on to trans folks. I saw that when my husband came out after we'd been together 16 years as lesbians, and I saw then, even for me, my tendency was to be like, let's get on with it, let's move to this next thing if that's what we're going to do, And so I see how sometimes what gets to young trans folks, that it's that. What about you, Chase?
Oh, I really feel strongly that James should have the last word in that invocation. I think it was really beautiful. And I think we should have trans young people talking to trans young people to answer that question, for sure. Excellent.
Beautiful. I have folks wondering, in terms of the work in horror genre, did anybody hear a work in horror prior to this show?
Yeah,
Liz?
I did. Toad Road was a film that I put out, came out about a dozen years ago, and sort of came up in the indie film horror genre space.
And are there favorite horror movies or shows that you can point to that you feel like you can see woven into this series, or you can see inspirational in some of what you do here?
Yeah, I think for every single episode, actually, over the course of the season, we really thought deeply about comparables, things from really more current Get Out to old Rosemary's Baby, and things that really shaped the genre. And it was about sort of taking the best of the old establishment great horror movies and bringing them into a really contemporary space. So they're references we went back to time and again.
Vera
Excellent.
actually recommended to me the movie Relic, and it's a beautiful movie if you haven't seen it. And I feel like because if you watch it all the way through, you'll find a moment of tenderness in it that I think speaks to something that's also in the heart of this series, that there's a lot of love. There's horror and a love of horror, and there's also a lot of love for the characters, and there's a tenderness there that I feel like is echoed in that movie.
Excellent. Relic is actually a very nice film. Stephanie, you also wrote the episode Ibeji. Am I saying this right? Ibeji?
Yeah.
Tell me about that episode as well. It's out on February 16th, and Elliot repeats on February 9th. So Elliot appears on, is it January 12th and then February 9th? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna make sure everybody gets that down. So, and then tell me about the other episode that you did, Stephanie.
Yeah, Ibeji I co-wrote with Melody Cooper, and it's a story about two Nigerian twin sisters, and as they navigate horrors stemming from the healthcare system and anti-Blackness, neglect. There's a demon in this episode that's particularly lovely. Something I noticed just today actually was that both of my episodes have storybooks in them. So you'll see that little connection too. I really love fairy tales. Yeah.
Excellent. So we actually only have time for another question or two. I want to open it up in case any of our members want to post another question here. I think we've gotten to the ones that we have here. James, was this your first time working in the horror genre?
That's a pretty complicated answer, actually. I did a tiny little horror movie or a horror short film when I was probably about 12 years old, and I don't think it ever actually came out. So I got the experience of working on set, but I don't know what happened with it. I haven't seen it. I don't think anyone has.
That's typical, right? Vera and Liz, the number of people have said that the ending of these shows sometimes make you want to see these characters again. Do they ever pop up in the universe again? Will we see Elliot again somewhere down the line?
You know, to date, you know, we've approached the format of the show so it's very similar to Twilight Zone, right? Mm-hmm. With the exception of, for our own, honestly, a lot of times entertainment planting Easter eggs across episodes. But I would not say that the door is closed to bringing back characters, you know, in the future. You know, who's to say? And, you know, hopefully as the show continues, it gives us that. I think it'd be really fun, frankly, to revisit as the show continues.
Excellent.
I
know
that people want to see these characters more, you know. I think
I mean that's the best part of this is one of the number one things people have said is, oh my God, where's Elliot going next? Where can we see Elliot next? So that's really lovely. You don't have that at the end of many shows. Also, both Elliot and Bagman, all the episodes I've seen, I could see developed into films too. The fact that you're able to do them in the tight 20 minutes is amazing.
It's a thing. Chase probably knows this too. It's a thing to cram, you know, because at the end of the day, this is first and foremost a character-driven psychological horror story, and Liz rips her hair out often because we try to jam a lot. Very rarely do we have too little to work with. So I agree with many of these could be features.
The last question here is, we've got a little video, I think, that Hannah's going to play, but one of the questions that John's asking is, what's the end message of the episode? Is there an end message of this episode?
I would love Chase. I would love to throw that to Chase.
Sure, yeah. I think we end our episode with our hero, understanding that trans people can live and thrive and survive, but that we still live in a culture of predatory, transphobic violence, and that we've got a lot of work to do.
I love it. It's perfect. Hannah, would you like to roll? First of all, thank you everybody for being here, for taking the time to talk this afternoon. Big thanks from GALECA, all of our members who are here. Really, really loved the episode. Definitely think it deserves a lot more visibility. I'm excited to be able to, we're going to end up posting this, this discussion on advocate.com, so it gets some wider view as well. And then Hannah's got a quick bathroom scene that she's going to show here that has James in, I believe it's probably the first bathroom scene. So let's bring that on.
Principal Myers?
Oh dear, this is the men's room.
I'm a boy.
You either got the equipment or you don't.
It's not that simple.
Well, maybe in the city this kind of thing flies, but around here the policy is no boys in the girls' room and no girls in the boys' room. Sounds pretty simple to me. But you know, I'm just here to enforce the rules. Hell, maybe there's something you're not telling me, so please, feel free to use the urinal, if you got what it takes.
I just love that. I wanted to, that the scene is so painful, and I don't feel like there's a trans person alive who doesn't actually understand Elliot's anxiety in that moment when he says, go ahead, use the urinal. We know exactly what kind of policing is happening, and we know just like the fear and danger of that moment. That was a great scene. James, can you actually just wind us up with a final word about filming that scene and the episode?
Yeah, I think like just generally on set, it was such a great experience and everyone was so amazing. I never had any problems because of being trans, but filming that one scene, oh my God, I've never been so pissed off in such a long time. I mean, David's just an actor, he's an incredible actor. But just having that conversation over and over, because, you know, we have to record several takes. Yeah. Wow, I stormed out of the room so times and I was genuinely angry. Like I had to cool off between each thing and I would just sit with my dad eating Skittles until we had to go again.
I will tell you that I know myself and several viewers were just waiting for the principal to die. That was like one of the overriding arcs of the show. So thank you all for being here. That was lovely. I can't wait for this to air, for the American public to see it. And any final words before I let you guys go?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, just
thank you
so much.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks on behalf of GALECA. And I can't wait to see the rest of the series.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much.